Of every miracle Jesus performed, this is the only one where he destroyed something. He healed the sick, he fed the hungry, he calmed storms and raised the dead. Every recorded miracle gives life, restores, repairs, multiplies, except one. On a single morning during the last week of his life, Jesus walked up to a tree, found it had nothing to give him, and killed it with a sentence. And the way Mark tells it, he seems to do it for a reason that is not fair. Jesus is hungry. He sees a fig tree in the distance, covered in leaves. He walks over to it looking for something to eat, and he finds nothing but leaves. So he says to the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." The next morning, the disciples pass the same tree, and it has withered from the roots up. If the story stopped there, you could maybe explain it. A hungry man, an empty tree, a moment of frustration. But Mark adds one line that makes the whole thing worse instead of better. He tells us, almost as an aside, that it was not the season for figs. Read that again, because it is the detail that makes everyone uncomfortable. The tree had no figs because figs were not in season. It was doing exactly what a fig tree is supposed to do at that time of year. And Jesus cursed it anyway. It feels like blaming a man for being asleep at midnight, like punishing a tree for obeying the calendar. For 2,000 years, this has been one of the hardest stories in the Gospels to make sense of. It looks petty, it looks out of character, it looks like the one time the Son of God lost his patience and a tree paid for it. But that single line, the one that seems to make Jesus unfair, is actually the key that unlocks the entire story. Once you understand what that tree was really doing, you realize Jesus was not being unreasonable at all. He was reading the tree like a book, and the tree was telling a lie. Start with when this happened, because the timing is not random. This is the last week of Jesus' life. He has ridden into Jerusalem to the shouts of the crowd. In a matter of days, he will be arrested, tried, and crucified. Every hour of this week is heavy with what is coming. And on the Monday of that week, he leaves the village of Bethany, where he had spent the night, and walks the road back toward the city. That is when he sees the tree. Hold on to that for a second. This is a man days away from the cross, carrying the weight of everything about to happen, and he stops to deal with a fig tree. That alone should tell you the tree is not really the point. People do not waste their final week on trivial things. When Jesus pauses on the road to Jerusalem to confront a fig tree, something larger is going on, and the disciples are about to be taught a lesson they will not understand until the next morning. It helps to picture the scene the way they would have lived it. Bethany sits on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives, less than 2 miles from Jerusalem. Jesus and the disciples would have walked that road every day of this final week, out to Bethany at night where it was safe, back into the city in the morning where the tension was building towards something. So this is an ordinary commute on an extraordinary week. They are tired. They have been sleeping away from home. And on this particular walk, in the cool of the morning before the heat sets in, Jesus is hungry, and a tree by the road catches his eye. Nothing about the setup feels loaded. It feels like a small, almost forgettable moment, which is exactly how the most important lessons often arrive. So what was it about this particular tree that caught his attention? To see it the way Jesus saw it, you have to know something about how fig trees actually grow. And this is where the story cracks open. A fig tree in that part of the world does something unusual. It produces its fruit before it produces its full canopy of leaves, or right alongside it. The early crop, small green buds the locals would pick and eat, appears first. The leaves come with them or just after, which means the leaves are a signal. When a fig tree is in full leaf, it is announcing to everyone walking by that it has fruit. The foliage is the tree's way of advertising a harvest.
This is the part modern readers miss, because most of us did not grow up around fig trees, and we assume fruit comes after leaves, the way it does with so many plants we know. But the fig works in its own order. Those first little buds are the tree's down payment, the proof that the real harvest is coming. They are edible, and they are also a sign. So a leafed fig tree with no early buds has broken its own pattern. It has done the showy part, the leaves, and skipped the substance, the fruit. To anyone who knew fig trees, and everyone in that crowd did, that was not normal growth. That was a warning sign. Travelers knew this. A person walking a dusty road could look across a field, see a fig tree dressed in green, and know they could go grab a handful of those early buds to eat. The leaves were a promise. They said, in the only language a tree can speak, "There is something here for you." A traveler did not have to walk all the way over to a bare tree, because a bare tree made no claim. But a tree in leaf was practically calling out to the road, "Come and eat. I have something for you." Now put that together with what Jesus found. He saw a tree in full leaf. From a distance, it looked like the most fruitful tree in the area, because it was the one making the loudest claim. Every other fig tree that was genuinely out of season would have been bare. No leaves, no advertising, no promise. Honest about where it was in the year. But this one tree stood there fully dressed, broadcasting a harvest to anyone who passed. And when Jesus came close, reaching for the early fruit that all those leaves had promised, he found nothing. Not even the small buds that should have come before the leaves. Just foliage. Just show. That changes the entire meaning of the line that bothered everyone. It was not the season for figs, is not the detail that makes Jesus unfair. It is the detail that exposes the tree. Because if it was not the season for figs, then no honest tree should have had leaves yet either. The other trees were bare and truthful. This tree was leafed and lying. It had wrapped itself in the appearance of fruitfulness during a season when it had no fruit to back it up. Jesus did not curse the tree for being barren. Plenty of trees were barren that week, and he walked past all of them. He cursed this one because it advertised what it did not have. The leaves wrote a check the branches could not cash. And suddenly, the whole thing stops being about a tree at all. Think about what kind of failure that actually is. There is a difference between an empty field that admits it is empty and a storefront with a grand sign and nothing on the shelves. One is honest about its lack. The other sells you a lie. Jesus had no quarrel with the honest bare trees. What he confronted was the pretense, the gap between the advertisement and the reality. And notice how specific that makes the judgment. He was not walking through the orchards that week, condemning every tree that had no fruit. The hills around Jerusalem would have been full of dormant fig trees, bare and waiting for their proper season, and he left every one of them alone. They were not lying. A bare tree in early spring is simply telling the truth about where it is in the year. There is no sin in a tree that has nothing yet and does not pretend otherwise. The honest, empty tree was safe. It was the dressed-up, empty tree that drew the word. This is the thing about the cursing of the fig tree that most people never reach, because they get stuck on the surface and never make it past, but it wasn't the season. The tree was a living illustration of one specific sin. It was not condemned for having nothing. It was condemned for pretending to have everything, for looking from a distance exactly like the real thing and being hollow up close. It is the difference between poverty and fraud. Poverty is honest. Fraud puts on a display. And the people watching him do this were about to walk straight into a place that was doing the very same thing on a massive scale. If a study like this, going underneath the surface of a hard passage, is something you want more of, the best way to support it is to become a channel member. That is what keeps this work going. And if you are already a member, thank you. You are part of every script we make. Now watch where Jesus goes next.
Here is a detail in how Mark wrote his gospel that once you see it, you cannot unsee. Mark has a habit. He likes to start one story, interrupt it with a second story, and then come back to finish the first. He wraps one event around another, like bread around a filling, because he wants you to read the two together. The inside story explains the outside story, and the outside story explains the inside one. The fig tree is one of these wrapped stories, and look at what Mark puts inside it. Jesus curses the tree on Monday morning. That is the first slice. Then Mark cuts away, and Jesus walks into Jerusalem and into the temple. And he does something violent. He starts turning over the tables of the money changers. He drives out the people buying and selling. He shuts the whole operation down, and he says the house that was meant to be a place of prayer for all nations has been turned into a den of robbers. That is the filling. Then the next morning, Mark comes back to the first story. The disciples pass the fig tree, and it has withered to the roots. That is the second slice, closing the sandwich. Mark did this on purpose. He is telling you, with the architecture of his own writing, that these two stories are one story. The fig tree is the temple. The temple is the fig tree. Walk through it and the parallel is exact. Jesus came to the tree hungry, looking for fruit, and found a tree covered in impressive leaves with nothing underneath. Then he walked into the temple, looking for the fruit a house of God should produce, and found the same thing. Impressive leaves everywhere. The building was breathtaking.
Herod had spent decades making it one of the wonders of the ancient world. The courts were full of activity, sacrifices, crowds, commerce, the constant motion of religion in full operation. From a distance, it looked like the most fruitful place on earth. It was covered in leaves. But Jesus came close, the way he came close to the tree, and reached in for the actual fruit. Justice, mercy, prayer. A people whose hearts were turned toward God. Room for the outsider and the foreigner to come and worship. And he found a marketplace. He found a system that had wrapped itself in the appearance of devotion while crowding out the very thing it was built for. Leaves without figs. A grand promise with nothing behind it. Look at what he actually objected to in there, because it sharpens the parallel even further. The money changers and the sellers of sacrificial animals had set up shop in the one part of the temple where outsiders were allowed to come. That outer court was the space set aside for the nations, for the foreigner who wanted to seek the God of Israel. And it had been turned into a noisy exchange, a place of buying and selling, so that the very people the temple was supposed to welcome had nowhere left to stand. The fruit a house of God should bear is a door open to everyone. Instead, the door had been blocked by commerce dressed in religious clothing. The leaves had crowded out the fruit, literally, in the layout of the building. That is why Jesus quoted the line about the house being meant as a place of prayer for all nations. He was naming the missing fruit out loud. The temple looked like the center of the world's devotion. Up close, it had pushed the world out. The tree never was the point. The tree was the sermon. Jesus acted it out on a roadside plant so the disciples would have eyes to recognize the same emptiness when they saw it dressed up in marble and gold an hour later. And here is the quiet brilliance of how Mark arranged it. The tree did not wither in the moment Jesus spoke to it. The disciples did not see it die until the morning after the temple. So the lesson landed in the right order. First, they watched him judge a tree that looked alive and was not. Then they watched him judge a temple that looked alive and was not. And only then, the next day, did they see the tree withered to the roots and understand that the word he had spoken was not an outburst. It was a verdict, and it had already come true. This was not a new picture either. Jesus was reaching back into something the prophets had been saying for centuries.
Long before that Monday, the fig tree had been one of the standard images for Israel in the Hebrew Scriptures. When the nation was right with God, the prophets pictured people resting safely under their own vines and fig trees, fed and unafraid. It was a picture of peace, of a people living in the security of God's blessing, each person under their own tree with nothing to fear. When the nation drifted, the same prophets reached for the fig tree to describe the loss. The prophet Jeremiah put it in words that sound almost like a script for what Jesus did. God says through him, "There will be no figs on the tree, and their leaves will wither." No fruit, withered leaves. Centuries later, on a road outside Jerusalem, those words happened to an actual tree in front of actual witnesses days before the judgment they pointed to came down on the city itself. The prophet Hosea used the same image from the other direction, remembering a time when God looked at Israel and saw something as delightful as the first ripe figs of the season, before that early promise was wasted. Over and over, across different prophets and different centuries, the fig tree shows up as a way of measuring the health of God's people. A thriving fig tree meant a people walking with God. A barren or withered one meant something had gone wrong at the root. So Jesus was not throwing a fit because he missed breakfast. He was doing what the prophets had always done. He was taking a fig tree and making it speak. The difference is that the prophets spoke the image in words, and Jesus performed it in real time, on a living tree, as a warning that anyone with eyes could read. That guards us against the easy misreading. Jesus was not short-tempered and hungry here. He was teaching, deliberately and prophetically, in the most important week of his life, pointing at the gap between what looks alive and what actually bears fruit. And that point's somewhere we should be careful about, because it is easy to turn this into a story about other people. One version of this teaching just aims it outward, at the temple, at the religious leaders, at a system that failed long ago. And all of that is in the text. But if that is all you take from it, you have done the exact thing the tree did. You have stood at a distance and looked fruitful while missing the fruit. Because the most uncomfortable truth in this passage is that the only thing Jesus ever cursed was not sin in the obvious sense. It was not the thief or the adulterer or the outsider. It was religion with no reality in it, appearance without substance, the costume of fruitfulness worn over an empty life.
And that is a temptation no one is safe from. It is possible to have all the leaves, to know the language, to show up, to look from the outside like someone whose life is full of God, and to be hollow where it counts. The leaves are easy. Anyone can grow leaves. Fruit is the hard part, because fruit is what is actually there when someone reaches in close. Days after Jesus read this lesson off a tree, that very kind of religion would put him on a cross. The polished, busy, impressive system that had no room for the Messiah standing in its courts would condemn him in the name of God. The leaves without fruit did their worst. And he let them, because the harvest he was after could only come the way it always comes, by going into the ground and dying first. And there is a strange mercy in that. The one person in the story who was all fruit and no pretense, who was exactly what he appeared to be down to the root, let himself be condemned by a system that was all appearance. He took the verdict the fig tree deserved. Out of his death came the thing the temple could never produce, a way for the outsider, the foreigner, the empty-handed, anyone honest enough to come with nothing, to finally bear fruit that lasts. The true tree was cut down so the barren ones could be given another season. So what do you do with a story like this, where the only thing the Lord destroyed was a fake?
Start by noticing what Jesus did not curse. He did not curse barrenness itself. This matters because most of us have barren seasons, stretches where the fruit just is not there, where we feel dry and unproductive and far from who we want to be. The story is not aimed at you in that season. Jesus told another fig tree story once, a parable, where the owner of a vineyard wants to cut down a tree that has not produced for 3 years, and the gardener steps in to plead for it. Give it 1 more year, he says. Let me dig around it, let me feed it. The patience of God toward an honestly struggling tree is real and it is long. The gardener does not give up on the barren tree. He gets down in the dirt and works on it. So hold those 2 trees side by side, because together they tell you exactly where the line is. The barren tree in the parable gets mercy, time, and a gardener on his knees in the soil. The leafy tree on the road gets a curse. The difference between them is not the amount of fruit. Both had none. The difference is that one was honest about it and one was not. One stood there plainly empty and got patience. The other dressed itself up as full and got judgment. What Jesus confronted on that road was the false advertisement. The tree had not just come up empty in a hard season. It had claimed to be full and was bare. And the question that leaves on the table is not, is your life perfectly fruitful right now? The question is quieter and harder. Does your appearance match your reality? Is there fruit under your leaves, or have you gotten very good at looking like there is? Because honest barrenness, God can work with. He digs around it, he waits, he feeds it and gives it time. It is the gap between the leaves and the figs that he walks up to and reads in a glance. The performance of a faith you are not actually living is the one thing this story warns against, and it warns against it without flinching. The next morning, the disciples walked past the same tree, and it had withered all the way down to the roots, not just the leaves, the whole thing. Because a tree that is all show on the outside is already dead on the inside, and the curse only made visible what was already true. The word over that tree was never really about figs. It was about the distance between what we display and what we are. Jesus walked the road to Jerusalem looking for something real, and he still does. He comes close. He looks under the leaves. He is not impressed by the canopy, and he is not fooled by the show. He is looking for fruit, and he is patient with the tree that has none yet, but is honest about it, and grieved by the tree that has dressed itself up to hide that it is empty. The good news buried in this hard story is that the same one who reads the tree so honestly is also the gardener who kneels down in the dirt and asks for more time. He is not looking for a perfect harvest. He is looking for something true, and he is willing to dig around your roots and feed you and wait, if you will stop growing leaves long enough to let him. If this opened up a passage that always confused you, subscribe and leave a comment. Even one word helps this reach someone who needs it. Share it with anyone who has ever found this story hard to understand. Pray for us as we keep digging into these texts. And may the one who looks past the leaves find something real and growing in you. God bless you.